this world today, we do have a whole bunch of people who just generally think broad brushstrokes, capitalism is just bad. And and crypto is just a digital kind of capitalism. Therefore, it's also bad. We decided that we're going to go out and tell people why Web3 is actually good. That's when I gave my talk at TED, when we sort of went on all these sort of traditional media as well. And, and a lot of people were like, like if you look at the comment section, I mean, this is a funny story. I had so many hate comments for my TED talk, because I was saying Web3 was actually something, positive, that they had to turn off comments. Right?
All right, with us on Coinage today, very excited to welcome the co-founder of Animoca Brands, one of the largest companies in the Web3 space, Yat Siu, on with us. Yat, so good to see you, man.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation, because slowly over time, we've kind of chatted with a lot of the leaders in your portfolio companies and just kind of everyone who's building tangentially around Animoca Brands. And so to have you on, it's been a long time coming, but thank you very much for making the time. I know it's late over there. I think just to start, I want to start with you personally and your background, because so many people have heard you kind of evangelize what Web3 is all about. Me and Coinage, as a DAO cooperative here in the US, we're super excited to kind of also be in the space with you guys, though much, much smaller. I want to start with kind of where things clicked for you, the reason why you wanted to dedicate so much of your time now to not just talking about Animoca Brands, but really, I think, what Web3 is here for. So why don't we start with kind of the first time it clicked for you, why Web3 was going to be as big as where you started your career back at the beginning and dawn of the internet?
Well, I mean, to us, really, it started with CryptoKitties. As the story goes, and as I think some people already know, our studio in Vancouver was actually involved in helping build some of it, particularly on the gaming side. And what was really kind of almost like a science experiment, just as we all know, basically took off and broke Ethereum in at least the early days. And that was something for us, a bit of a wake-up call to say, oh, wait, hold on a second. What exactly is this sort of NFT thing, and how does it actually work? And that's actually when we started to realize that you could actually really own your digital assets, not in the Bitcoin sense that was kind of always there, but it felt sort of more like digital gold, right? So it was something that was far more removed from our perspective, but that actually you could own your individual gaming items, and that you had control over them, and you had sovereign ownership, and the property rights attached to it open up all of these dimensions that we in the gaming space, which is really sort of what we were as a company and still are as a gaming company, is really what we thought that we could sort of do all the things we dreamt of doing, because most gamers actually wish they could own these items and transfer them, or build reputation on top of them, or all that kind of stuff. Like, for instance, if I was able to still have my old Ultima Online or World of Warcraft items, to me, these aren't just necessarily related to what it's worth. I think too many people are focused on, because you can trade it, there's value. I mean, that's one part of it. But actually what was more important to us, and I think for most gamers around the world, was the fact that you had provenance and proof that you were there, right? It's this cultural, social, symbolic status item that was really important to us, just similarly how we think of these items in the real world. That's kind of what clicked. But then it evolved over time, in the sense that, we started to understand more deeply the aspects around, what property rights could do, digital property rights could do broadly around sort of, not just our industry, but for the world. And so this is kind of, when we started expanding our thesis around digital property rights around, actually, this is more than just gaming items. Gaming could be essentially the Trojan horse that can help it all make happen and sort of scale that. But really, this is about sort of, a new kind of fairer kind of capitalism with stakeholder capitalism, where we could all own a stake in the network, and sort of that sort of evolution of sort of where this sort of can really build a better future, right? And so I think that evolution then sort of changed the way that we thought about investing in the space. So we invested very broadly. Today we have over 540 portfolio companies, for instance, not just in gaming, but really in everything to help advance the space. So I think Animoca could be viewed more broadly, really as a Web3 ecosystem player rather than just a gaming company, which sometimes people still think we are, just because we cut our teeth in the gaming space originally.
For sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting too. And obviously, as a builder in the content space and community ownership space for what we're doing here at Trustless Media and Coinage, I think it has been pretty interesting to try and put Animoca Brands in a box, because you're right. It would be a misnomer to say you guys are a gaming company. It almost looks like you guys are just a Web3 company in the way that you're unlocking network effects for people who are building in this new era of the internet. And I feel like ownership is kind of the backbone of that. But
It
I'm kind
is.
of curious to get your take in terms of what you say is the pillar between all this. Is it fair to say it's more network effects in the idea of having projects that are building their own community, but then Animoca Brands helps them augment and figure out how to kind of scale quicker by plugging it into all the other companies that you have in your portfolio?
So the core thesis and the pillar of everything is digital property rights, right? So we want to do everything to advance digital property rights. But then the question becomes, well, what is this digital property that you own? And so our definition of that is that you end up owning a piece of the network that you're helping grow, meaning that you benefit from the network effect of these networks, which
Mm-hmm.
wasn't possible before Web3, right? So this is represented through the token. And by the way, when we say token, we don't just mean fungible token. It could also be a non-fungible token. Both of them, from our lens, are essentially representations of their various network effects, right? Like we think, for instance, as a brand, whether this is a Nike or an Adidas, for instance, or Gucci, we think of them also essentially as containers of network effects, maybe more invisible or not as tangible, or maybe not something that you can own. It's owned by the family or the company, but it's still a network effect because when you own a famous brand, then you're sort of emanating its network effect to others, or you want to have its association of that network because it gives you a certain kind of network prestige, for instance, right? And so whether it's an NFT or whether it's a fungible token doesn't matter to us. These are all essentially ways in which you can sort of represent and own a piece of the network and the representative network effects. And we see this also as an entirely new asset class that never really existed before. I think a lot of people sometimes confuse it. Sometimes they say, "Oh, well, isn't it just sort of a more advanced form of equity or shareholding, or maybe a digital form of shareholding?" And to some extent, it is, but it's much more than that because in the physical world or the current traditional world, as it were, if you were a really famous Instagrammer, it doesn't give you any benefits in owning anything of Instagram, for instance. And likewise, if you're a shareholder in Facebook slash Meta, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't give you any benefits of being influential in Instagram, right? The two don't sort of interoperate with each other. But in a token network, actually, they tie together and they're linked. And this is actually what's really powerful about that. And it unlocks, I think, the value of these network effects. So really, our mission is digital property rights, and digital property rights, the way of the kind of property you own are essentially these tokens that are representation of these network effects. And we think of network effects as the assets of the future because everything is around network effects. Like the most valuable companies today in the digital world in Web 2, whether this is Apple or Facebook or Google, or Microsoft even. I mean, yes, they produce products and services, but their
Mm-hmm.
underlying asset is the network effect, which they have exclusive access to, for which they charge you a fee to come in and use these network effects. And
Sure.
now we can own them through tokenization. So that's really the core thesis.
And it's a walled garden too, in terms of the Web2 giants, in terms of there is no
Right.
interoperability, there is no take your assets elsewhere, there is none of that. That is unlocked
Yes,
now by
correct.
Web3. And so I think it is kind of exciting to see what you guys are building. And I want to touch on that too, because for people here at Coinage, our NFT holders who also co own us, they would know we are also a Mochaverse NFT holder. And it's been exciting to kind of watch the process in how all of this has happened, right? Because you guys have been investing in companies through Animoca Brands and the venture arm for a while. And now to see it kind of come to fruition, there are a lot of questions for whether or not this is really kind of a metaverse play, or to your earlier points just then, more of a network effects play. And so I'm kind of curious. You had the token launch trading about 10 cents ish right now. And when you kind of dig into where you want to take this project, there's the Mocha ID, so it's the idea of digital identity. How do you see kind of the token underlying, to your point, the network effects among all of the different brands that exist under the Animoca umbrella?
Well, I mean, so Mochaverse really for us is a way in which we can unlock and share the network effects of what Animoca has built and then expand from that. And I think, one of the key things you had sort of touched on earlier is it's true, Web2 companies don't have a way in which these network effects can be shared with each other. In fact, they're sort of tend to be quite sort of competitive with each other. And so through very thin rails, they sort of in some ways cooperate with each other, but not really. But more importantly, the user doesn't get any benefit from that, which means that the ability to scale these network effects actually tend to be more capped. Right. So in other words, even though, Apple and Google are very large, at the end of the day, if they wanted to, what would happen if Apple and Google's network effects were actually had the ability to interoperate with each other, that we think there would be a value explosion that would take place in terms of what you could do, right? Imagine every Web2 network that was sort of now able to sort of permissionlessly interoperate with each other, for instance. Well, guess what? That's what blockchain is, right? So
Yeah.
regardless of whether it's Ethereum or Solana or Ton or Mocha or Sand, doesn't really matter, right? The point is that you can access them all permissionlessly. Whether you want to build on it or not, that's a different question. However, you have the right to do so, and you have the ability to avail to their network effects. But actually, in so doing, you help grow with their corresponding network effects as well. I mean, remember back in the day when everyone was talking about Ethereum killers, and now everyone's talking about essentially being an L2 and sort of growing together, because that's actually what happens in a permissionless network structure. In fact, the more open you are as a network, and the more sort of, let's call it, interoperable you are, actually the faster these network effects can accrue. Which is also why, when you think about the per user value of a Web3 user, if you want to call it an ARPU, or some kind of sort of user denominated
Hmm.
value, it's significantly higher, because you can avail yourself to much more broader network effects that are owned by the user than actually by a platform that doesn't share any of that, right? So that's kind of important to understand. And so where does Mochaverse come in? Well, Mochaverse is, started off really as a way to sort of open up our networks of our 540 portfolio companies and our millions of users for other people to build on top of it. However, what we quickly realized is that actually at its core, really, we're building a reputation layer. And I think this is sort of one of the key things that we think will make Web3 better. Because again, how we are so indexed to the entire Web3 space.
Hmm.
We think of Animoca as sort of our common cause is the success of the Web3 industry, which was somewhat by design, right? If we ended up only building one product, for instance, or only investing in a handful of companies, then almost by necessity we have to basically sort of focus our attention on these few projects, and in a kind of semi-zero sum approach, try to sort of succeed in them, right? That's kind of the typical thing that happens when you really all have all your eggs in one basket. But if
Yeah.
you're actually somewhat broadly distributed and you're kind of playing more the ecosystem, then it allows you to holistically view the entire space as to what is really good for the ecosystem as a whole, right? Where of course we would benefit, but everyone else would benefit from as well. And we quickly realized that actually what was really missing in the Web3 space was reputation. And we don't mean reputation just in terms of, well, what's your identity? I mean, Mocha ID is our identity layer. It's about essentially accruing a kind of reputation in your identity that you can basically carry on, basically from chain to chain, from network to network, from activity to activity, bootstrapped by our portfolio companies first, and of course our own companies, where they can basically give reputation to essentially the users that are using it. And why is this important? Because in the real world, actually, this is how we create trust, right? I mean, this is the irony of this sort of permissionless trust that we have in the network. But the problem is that when everyone can be anonymous, I think we're taking that extreme of the anonymity in terms of essentially imagine dealing with strangers every single day. That's not the construction of trust here that we're talking
Exactly.
about, right? Like I think we can all respect that I don't need to know everything about your life. Maybe I don't even need to know your name, but I do need to know that you're a good standing citizen, or that you're not going to steal from me, or that you're going to do something ridiculous, right? Otherwise,
Hmm.
if every person was out for themselves in a kind of Lord of the Flies type of way, in society, there would be no society. It would totally break down.
Exactly.
And I think this is kind of where we find ourselves in the criticism on Web3 is, for people who are not in Web3, it's like, how do I trust it? And right now we're telling everyone, well, just, make sure that you have your security protocols. And I think of it a little bit like, I guess maybe this is why some people in America sort of sort of accept it as a way of thinking, is because most people around the world wouldn't think this way, which is says, well, take care of your damn security, carry around your own guns, right? Which is one way to do it, right? But I don't think that's how most of society works, right? We want to interact and work with people that we can trust, and where does this trust come from? And I think this is where reputation comes in, right?
Hmm.
And so for instance, if I knew, in the real world, that you worked at this company, and that there's all these people that have common friends, and you've graduated from maybe this university, or have some kind of background, that reputation becomes something that you want to protect over time, because
Yep.
that's actually who you are. But in Web3, it's very easy to start a new identity, and we've not actually. And again, there's nothing wrong with starting different identities, to be clear, because in real life we have different type of personas, right? To our family, to our work, to our friends, to our alumni, whatever. We have slightly different ways in which we interact, but we are still the same person. and we still have a reputation amongst all of them. But
Yeah.
in Web3, what kind of happens is, for instance, let's say I do something bad in Hong Kong, then I can just hop over to Singapore and start all over again, and there's no consequences. And that's not how the real world works, but that's basically what's happening in Web3. And this is why Web3, I think, is having a little bit of a bad rap, not
Yes.
because you can't have sort of permissionless trust. It's because we're not using the technology to create essentially a reputation trust layer that can cross over cross chain and has meaning. And so the simplest example of this, and this is why we think it works so well with Mochaverse as a bootstrap of this, is that hey, if you're a good actor, you'll get more airdrops, right? I mean, that's the best form of incentive we can start off with, right?
Yeah.
If you're loyal, if you show through on-chain activity that you're someone who's building in the network, we'll reward you more. Because our industry is plagued by bot farming, by people basically like we've had this problem ourselves when we KYC our customers. It turns out that something like sometimes up to more than half of our users end up getting sold to some other person or to some bot farm to basically sort of access an airdrop or sort of access an NFT mint or that kind of stuff, right? So it's through these own pain points that we realized, wait a second, how do we create an actual sort of ecosystem where we can trust each other? We have to build a reputation layer that basically sort of accrues over time. Because the other belief we have, and this is why we're so focused on NFTs since day one, is that at the end, as humans, we care more about cultural, social, and symbolic status than we
Yeah.
care purely about our economic. The economic is important, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, the economic builds essentially our cultural, social, and symbolic capital. And
Yeah, I
that's what
wanted to ask
NFTs
you.
represented so well.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that too, because you're kind of touching on a lot of community points and aligned interest and reputation here, and you're right. There have been a lot of aspects of Web3 that have been dogged, and one of them that I think is constantly interesting to ask people their opinions on are meme coins, because you can kind of take the idea that meme coins are indicative of what Web3 is all about in terms of merging kind of attention online with money online. And they are two important mediums on the internet. But if you just have a token by itself and just speculation by itself and no sense of community or aligned interest around potentially a mission, I get the sense that some people are very tired of seeing 2 million meme coins launched in the year 2024 and saying, hey, all these things have kind of gone down in value. What's the point of this? So what's Yat Siu's take on meme coins?
So first of all, I think of meme coins very similar to sort of chat rooms, IRC chats back in the early days of the internet, or Reddit subgroups, or apps. Back in sort of when we were sort of in the mobile days. There's an app for that. Like everyone was basically just coming up with products. What was the general thing that they're all trying to do? Gather attention. That's really what they're trying to do. And the attention obviously came with some business prospect. You could be successful, you could be famous. Even if you wanted to be famous, at the end of the day, it's a prospect of having some kind of financial success in the future, right? There's an element of that. The difference about doing this through a token is that the financial value starts to sort of enumerate very, very quickly. And so what we're seeing, to me, with the millions of meme coins launching, I kind of see it as a little bit like millions of websites, or millions of chat groups, or millions of message boards. Like, to me, it's the same thing. And some, very few of them, will actually succeed because they create sort of an aligned community interest and they're actually building something lasting. And most of them will die and fizzle, which is all part of sort of the typical sort of, I guess, moment that we see. And I think one of the things, when you think about sort of meme coins, I think of them as really sort of cultural experiments that do, however, have the financial aspect related to that. And
Mm-hmm.
we have to call it what it is. A lot of people are just gambling and speculating on this as well, and that's actually something that isn't really great for the rep of the space, but is something that is, to me, a reflection of the sign of the times that we live in as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, the whole sort of what's happening in Web3 and the adoption and interest in it is that the world needs actually a better solution. I'm not saying that's meme coins, by the way, but a better solution towards more inclusion in sort of this capitalist framework that we've basically left most of the world out of, right? And so if we had a more, let's call it, fairer society, then the drive to meme coins wouldn't be the way that it is right now. I think that's something that we also have to reflect in the fact that we've got a situation where our parents' generation are better off than many of their children, which is, again,
Yeah.
if you think about it, over the last 20, 30 years, would be an unthinkable sort of thing back in the day. And I think it's also one of the reasons why the political landscape has turned in many places more anti-capitalist, because it hasn't worked for them. But that's
Mm-hmm.
precisely because capitalism, as we know it, has been somewhat perverted because of basically the centralization of power, which again, blockchain, I think, solves so nicely, even if people don't fully understand that, right? So I think there's reflections on that. But again, I'm not against meme coins. I think meme
Yeah.
coins are, part of sort of the culture of sort of learning about Web3, and the fact that it's really, again, what are tokens? Tokens are, representations of network effects. And what is network effects really in some ways is, a big part of the attention economy. And so launching a meme coin is really, at the end of the day, just trying to draw attention to whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I fully see an evolution from that, where people start saying, okay, fine, okay, we've gotten into the space, and now, what more can we do? What can we learn about this? And this goes back, by the way, to reputation, which is that, all those people that are doing stuff, some of them, even though they don't have a reputation system, will have built a reputation, good or bad, for the activities that they've done on chain. And
Hmm.
those identities start becoming valuable because there's more opportunities or things that could happen to them because they've created a good reputation. And the ones that have a bad reputation basically just go away.
Yeah, I think obviously a lot of that's earned over time, and so I feel like
Correct.
maybe there's even an added special premium to meme coins that have not tanked, and the ones that have stuck around longer. You can look at Dogecoin even, I suppose, and kind of say, look, this has been around for a very long time now, and so it kind of it brings, to your point on reputation, a little bit more respect. I just think, and I would agree with you, speculation by itself not a bad thing. That would be a normative statement, but objectively, unless there's kind of like a reason for it, then it's kind of raising the question of what are we building. And I think that's kind of where Coinage came from, was we don't want to just kind of put these out there. We'll let people buy NFTs that let them become members in co-owning what we're building, and then we can distribute dividends. So there is a real value attachment. But I am curious for your kind of take, Yat, in terms of where the space is. I feel like there's a lot of incumbents that started in Web3, and they're like, look, if we ever attach real value to these things beyond just pure speculation, it'll almost undo all the excitement that exists for just pure speculative projects. And so for a project like ours, we've actually gotten some pushback from people in the space who are like, yo, be careful. But I think that it's important to kind of eventually do. And it seems like what you're trying to do with Mochaverse and the Mocha token is more akin to that, where it's like, no, we are building real value here. And our intuition is to give some of that back to the people who supported us.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, what we think about any kind of network, right, is there's different types of network effects as well, right? So we can't just look at a network effect as a single network effect that is true for everything, right? In fact, network effects could be in the form of brand, or they could be forming a certain kind of product or service. Social networks, for instance, community, friendship, right? Like these are all forms of a network that create basically network effects within them, and they're
Mm-hmm.
multifaceted, right? I mean, there's probably 30 or 40 different types of network effects if you were to sort of really analyze them deeply. And so we can't actually just sort of broad brushstrokes say, hey, every token has the same kind of network effect. That's not true at all.
Yeah.
And I think, when you think about, for instance, what's happening with meme coins, to me, they're community construction, and they're basically, a how should I put it? They're the speculation side, but I guess many of them are basically going after the sort of belief network effect, right? Basically, it's the faith-based network effects, which we have in the real world today as well, right? Whether this is religion, whether this is politics, whether this is whatever it is, there's aspects of how we follow around things where network effects are built around sort of things that we believe in, right? And some of that belief might be simply just having fun, right? But other things, for instance, even if you look at the sort of non sort of Web3 world, with things like GameStop, right? There's people who just simply won't sell their shares in GameStop because they're just holding it as a statement, right? And that kind of goes back to sort of when you talk about reputation. To me, it's not just about the project, but it's much more about the individual. Because at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, let's say you're a user who holds, who has, like, I mean, this is an extreme example. I'm not suggesting people do this, but let's say someone who basically bought into 20 meme coin projects and never sold a token, right? And he's now known as, sort of, diamond hand, for instance, right? After I think that a person like that, after a certain period of time, will have created a respect and an admiration of that community, regardless of his wealth, that money can't buy at that point, right? That
Yeah.
identity, whether they know who he is or not, is now Mr. Diamond Hand, for instance, right? And the result is that when he invests in a project or when he does something on chain, never revealing his identity, everyone else around will say, "Oh, he did something. We can follow that. And that's
Yeah.
interesting. Whether it's good or not is different, right? And most people will look at, oh, is he a successful investor? Is he smart about it? Sure, all these things matter. But I guess I'm just saying is that, this is basically where your reputation starts to layer on top of each other. And
Yeah.
that's why it's so important to have it, because once you build that reputation, you will actually not want to lose it, right? Which means you're going to start behaving and acting in a certain way to ensure that that reputation isn't being tarnished. And I think
And
this
yeah.
is how the real world actually sort of operates as well. We don't believe, for instance, that people are. I mean, there's a few exceptions in the world, but generally, we don't think people are out there really to hurt others or to sort of do bad things.
Mhm.
But there is temptation, right? It's like some many people might sort of, if $1,000 is on the floor, some people will try to give it to the person who lost it, and some people will take it. And one can argue one is immoral and one is not, but at the end of the day, right, the person who took that money that wasn't his but found it somewhere on the street might say, hey, you know what, it's he lost it and whatever. And there's always, it's the temptation, right?
Yeah.
But if there's a reputation attached to it, for instance, right, if then you start thinking again and go, oh, you know what, there's consequences. And I think society functions on that better. And I think we need that in Web3. And that's why
Yeah.
we're so focused on reputation.
No, it's important. I think when we designed our Coinage mint first, everyone was able to choose whether they would want to trust the next person who minted after them or not, and we kind of had a trust game,
Mhm.
and what happened next was dependent on how people answered. And it was kind of a fun game theory game for us to use during our mint. But you kind of mentioned Diamond Hands McGee, if I can call him that, and it is
Sure.
true. Reputation matters, and I almost feel like, yeah, I wonder if I can turn that question back on you almost
Mm.
because it seems like you've become kind of like the Masayoshi Son at SoftBank for Web3. And I'm super excited to have you on the show because you're like so dedicated to this space that your reputation has kind of become Web3's reputation in a sense. And I kind of feel like maybe you have, bet on all these projects to show like, look, here's how strong my convictions are. And now if I'm reading the news headlines correctly, it looks like you guys at Animoca Brands have plans to IPO. And I feel like you're now pitching the idea of Web3 to the wider world of investors. And there's so many questions that people on the outside might have about us in the inside of it. How hard is it for you to kind of show, okay, look, we're sitting on all these network effects. We're sitting on some of these tokens. I've held them. There's something here. What has that process been like right now? Because it looks like you're focused on the Hong Kong market. How hard is it to pitch Animoca now to public markets?
I mean, first of all, it's much easier today than it was, say, 5 years ago. I mean, and I think most people might not even notice. When we were once a publicly listed company in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
In 2018, when I took over the company in late 2017, I think our market cap was $5 million. 5 million. Okay, right. And so try to pitch that, and then remember, if you remember back in 2018, what the state of our industry was like. I think Bitcoin at one point was hovering at $3,000. And Ethereum basically sort of. I think at one point even went slightly below 100 at some point. Like anyway, it was dire times. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so crypto wasn't popular. Everything was sort of, the ICO sort of period was terrible for us because there was a ton of scams as well and all that type of stuff. So that was 2018 and 2019, and that's really when Animoca basically decided this is the time to go in Web3, right? We couldn't have picked a better time, and so it's in comparison to then, this is relatively smooth sailing. Again, nothing smooth sailing, but it feels much easier because we're bigger as a business, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
are sitting on billions of dollars of assets. The business generates cash. We're EBITDA positive. The company is growing, and so we have a platform. And I think today, one thing I can say, even if you're not in Web3, if we want to have a meeting with any company in the world of any type, not related to just Web3 but Web2, we can get an audience because they've
Mm-hmm.
heard of us somewhere, because we're sort of covered by some news or some people know us, or whereas 5 years ago we couldn't. So it's much easier to pitch now. I think, and also because of that, there's a certain level of sort of attention you get. They may not agree with crypto, but they'll at least respect the fact that we've called a market that most people might have sort of written off say 5 years ago, right? And said,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is never going to work. And now here we are, right? And so I think there is a level of respect that comes with at least sort of saying, okay, fine, you saw something that I didn't. So, what else do you have to say, right? But of course, the driver explain to people why Web3 is so important. That to me is really our greater purpose and our greater cause, because we actually think that Web3 will create a much more sustainable future for everyone involved, because
Yeah.
everyone essentially can be a stakeholder. And that's the mission and the story we've been trying to tell everyone, which has been met with, in some places it's very welcomed, and in
Mm-hmm.
other places it's not been popular, because at heart Web3 is a capitalist framework,
Yeah.
and in this world today, we do have a whole bunch of people who just generally think broad brushstrokes capitalism is just bad, and
Mm-hmm.
and crypto is just a digital kind of capitalism. Therefore, it's also bad, and so it's all covered in this area. And even though they might not express it that way, that's actually the undertone, right?
Yeah.
When people say, "Oh, we don't want to," this type of stuff shouldn't be financified, when in fact it already is. It's just don't see it, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not exposed to you, right? So it came same kind of things. So that's really been the bigger part of that. And you know, as Animoca, where we started, I would argue where we really rose more in prominence was actually in 23 rather than in the NFT, let's call it growth cycle, which was
Yeah.
21 and early 22. Yes, sure. I mean, NFTs became big. And even today is about a $10 billion industry, annually. So it's definitely nothing to sort of scoff at, even if it's smaller than it was during the heyday. However, that said, in when all the stuff happened with FTX and Terra Luna, most of our, peers decided, for all sorts of reasons, not because they did anything wrong, just to kind of step back, or to sort of, move away a little bit, because the market was negative, and sort of, we did the opposite. We decided that we're going to go out and tell people why Web3 is actually good. And so I think this happened really mostly in late 22 and 23, like when the
Mm-hmm.
industry was collapsing, at least from an exterior perspective. We just went out and sort of waved the banner flag and basically said, look, 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 actually this is really important. That's when I gave my talk at TED, when we sort of went on all these sort of traditional media as well. And and a lot of people were like, like, if you look at the comment section, I mean, this is a funny story. I had so many hate comments, for my TED talk, because I was saying Web3 was actually something positive, that they had to turn off comments. Right.
Yeah.
And but you have to kind of go out and sort of, we passionately believe in this, but also the only way that you're going to get people to understand is to go out and sort of say it, right, and
Yeah.
in what you believe in. And I think this is kind of really when I think Animoca became, more, let's sort of, known, because the business aside, we actually became sort of, I guess, more of that face, inadvertently, because we wanted
This
to
is what
sort
I'm
of,
saying. This is what
yeah.
I'm saying.
but
Diamonds
but
handing, diamonds handing from a
yeah.
reputation perspective of really being the Mossa sign. I think
Yes.
that's fair. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe fair.
However, I wouldn't go as far as to say that I'm anything close to. I mean, Massa is a legend. He's a slightly different character, I would say, as well. So certainly wouldn't put ourselves in that bucket. But we certainly want to evangelize and grow the Web3 space, and that's certainly
Yes.
something that we are, constantly trying to do. So trying to elevate. Basically, we're trying to elevate the conversation, that Web3 is actually much bigger than what you all think, because very often people still think about tokens as ways to fundraise, or people think about sort of, meme coins only as a thing, or that it's all not real, all these things, we have to keep sort of, explaining.
Well, the conviction bet is there, and I guess that's the main similarity. And I think, speaking to 2018, obviously that was my experience as well. I pitched the idea of doing what we're doing now in terms of a crypto show at CNBC and got laughed out of the room. So that was never going to happen back then. But, I'm glad that it didn't, because NFTs came around and the involvement of community and the idea of tokenizing community was not a thing so much in 2018. It was all DeFi and all financialization, as you said. And now it's become culture and narrative and everything else around letting people co-own what we're building on the internet, which has never been possible before, which honestly, I think I'm just glad that it didn't happen then, because now there's so much more to do now. And one of the big questions, Yat, from our NFT holders, when I told them you were coming on, a lot of people threw in questions, and you mentioned gaming at the beginning of the interview. So much right now around gaming, and obviously you guys as an investor in Axie and a lot of other Web3 gaming projects, very dedicated to the space. One of the questions now is about Telegram and Ton gaming. Animoca, one of the larger validators on the Ton blockchain. One of the questions from our holders was, would love to know how you view the Telegram gaming ecosystem relative to much of what has already been invested into. Is the hype real, a passing fad? What differentiates a Telegram game versus a traditional iOS game? So we'll start there.
So I would say it's not very differentiated from an iOS game when you consider iOS in 2010, 2011. Okay, right. And I think this is the lens that we need to look at much of the Web3 games today, broadly speaking, that, it is not yet at a level where, the mobile gaming industry as at present, but a lot of it has also to do with the fact that the distribution channels have been actually locked, right?
Mm-hmm.
So up until pre-Telegram, actually there was no sort of way to really distribute your Web3 game at scale because Apple, Google, Steam, like all the major distribution platforms, be it PC and mobile, basically restricted you. Right. And I think Apple just recently said, oh, okay, fine, you can have NFTs in your application. There just can't be any utility for the NFT. I mean, seriously? Like, what's the point in all that? Right. So this is really just sort of making sure that you won't have success on the App Store. And then on came Telegram. And that's the reason we backed them early on and sort of saw the opportunity because here you've got close to a billion users that essentially are launching at the time have launched a blockchain that really was going to sort of tie in everything that Telegram was doing through Ton to open up essentially. Like I think of Ton as literally sort of the open network for Telegram in and of itself, even though it's called the open network. Actually, it's really leveraging the Telegram infrastructure and opening it up to the world and allowing for these type of viral mechanics where applications like Gamey end up having close to 100 million users, of which 3 to 4 million are active, or Catizen or Hamster Combat or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the many of these games look very much like mobile games 2010 2011. Remember Angry Birds or Mafia Wars? Like these were all very simple type of games, clicker games, that kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
but what it did was it sort of brought the users into that ecosystem and it gave people attention and they realized that and some of them had fun, but it
Yeah.
basically allowed essentially new applications to basically be developed because now the users were on them, right? I mean, people might not remember, but the number one, the top grossing apps for Apple for the iOS App Store was actually games for the longest of times.
Okay, you're
And in
taking me
fact,
back. You're
yeah,
taking me back. I'm remembering like the beer app where like people were just kind of joking around with that and
yeah,
just kind of like how big
remember
it would grow.
I forgot the name, the talking cat, where all you were doing was basically just
Yeah.
like forgot the name, right? Where you're basically just talking and the cat would just talk back what you said in a funny voice. I mean, like these were just absolutely ridiculous nonsense apps, you could say, but they drew your attention and they
Yeah.
showed you what was possible. And I think
So that's kind of like
what's
where we're at, is what you're saying in Web3
yes,
gaming. Like
exactly,
that's where we're at,
exactly.
and you got to
That's where
show
we
how
are.
the ownership works because it is kind of similar. I mean, we were just looking at Hamster Combat and the idea of people using
Yeah.
massage guns to tap away on these tap to earn games. And if you kind of go
Yes.
back to 2009, the silliness is still there. So look, I'm not making any normative statements either. I'm just saying it is kind of funny. But to your point on maybe crowding out some of this stuff, right? When you add in the tap to earn, play to earn, a lot of people with Axie were like, okay, if we're thinking about incentives, is there a crowding out effect that can go wrong in Web3 gaming yet when it comes to maybe saying like, hey, look, it's not about having fun anymore. It's about earning. Like, do you see maybe warped incentives ever potentially being the unseen downfall of Web3 gaming?
No. And the reason why I don't is because if we assume that everyone thinks exactly the same and that we're all hive minds and we're
Mm-hmm.
basically nothing more than ants, then maybe, sure, right? Because if everyone felt a certain way and all moved there, but that's not how we are, right? And that's and this comes down to at least our own insight in the gaming industry that the conversion rate for people going into paid games is on average 1.8%.
Mm-hmm.
So the business model of gaming is freemium, and people play the game for free, and essentially less than 2% on average convert to becoming a paid user.
Mm-hmm.
That's our industry, okay? And that drives, today something 250 to 300 billion dollars, gaming industry, right? So the point of that, the reason why I'm saying that is that the success doesn't come from every person adopting it. The success comes from that there's a conversion rate of people coming in. So if 100 million people come in, and 5 or 10 million people basically stick around because they love this type of stuff, and 90 million of them say, well, this is not my kind of application, and move on. Well, first of all, these have been onboarded because they now have a wallet, and someone else has an opportunity to say, hey, I've got a different application that you might like, right? And I mean, the App Store. Remember the time when there was an explosion of there was an app for everything, right? Whether
Hmm.
it's horoscope or calculators or this or whatever. And by the way, the calculator could be pink or it could be gray or it could have unicorns or it could be, all sorts of funny stuff, right? That's kind of the phase that we're in, right? And so I think people are discovering what applications stick or not. But actually, at the end of the day, some of them will become more popular than others, and they will succeed. And I think
Hmm.
the portion of users, and this is another important point, is that actually what's happening in Web3 is you're not only onboarding gamers who play games. In fact, they are likely to be sort of the harder batch to convert because they're already playing certain type of games. Actually, what you're onboarding is a new kind of gamer that didn't exist before. Right? So there's about 6+ billion people online, and there's 3.4 billion people who play games. Right? So we see the market expansion for Web3 gaming not to be only the 3.4 billion who play games today, but actually the bigger opportunity in the near term is the 3 billion or like 2 point something billion who are not playing games today, right? And I think people will forget, for instance, that the growth of the mobile game industry didn't come from people who were playing console games and
Hmm.
said, hey, wow, I can play this on my phone. No, it was an entirely new gamer that didn't exist. And he got interested in gaming because, he was like, oh, I don't want to have a controller. The PlayStation seems expensive, but hey, I got a phone and I can play a game, and that's kind of fun. And that's
Yeah.
actually how the gaming industry went from hundreds of millions of people in 2008 to basically 3 billion people. It was entirely because of mobile gaming, bringing in a new type of gamer that didn't exist before. And so Web3 to us is a new type of gamer as well. It's a more passive gamer. It's a gamer who sort of has ownership. And maybe there's a financial layer to it. But, for those of you who are in the gaming space, strategy games, sims, simulators, the tycoon games. Like, I mean, what are they all about? They're about money, and they're about economics, and they're about
Yeah.
simulation and strategy, right? So that category essentially has already sort of existed in a more niche way, but is now greatly expanding in Web3. So
Well,
I think of this as sort of a combination of these things rather than specifically, hey, people will say tap to earn is bad, and so they see this crowding out effect. Actually, it's not about the crowding out. It's about finding essentially, your 1,000 true customers, which these games are doing. Like Axie went through that moment and now have basically found their 300,000 true customers, so to speak,
hmm.
and growing from there and doing quite well.
Well, I think to your point too, like the mobile phone, the iPhone, and the App Store, and the explosion of everything there, again, making it kind of easier because you had it in your pocket. I think the industry, crypto right now, is kind of going through a very similar account abstraction. You don't even know you have a wallet situation that is
Great.
also accelerating things, which is quite exciting to watch. But yeah, I know our time is dwindling here. So every time we have a visionary such as yourself on the show, it's nice to kind of ask what's to come in the short term. We always ask people what their big, bold claims are. 2024 is shockingly already coming to a close almost. So I'd love to get your predictions for kind of next year. And it doesn't need to be related to anything Animoca. It could just be space in general, the Web3 space in general. Because
Yeah.
as we already talked about, so many people are sleeping on a lot of things. What's your big, bold claim for crypto?
Well, first of all, I think we're actually going to get from our lens. I think we'll get to our first 100 to 200 million sort of on-chain users. In the next 12 to 18 months, driven in large part because of what we see with Ton and particularly gaming. And I think this is, and I don't mean people who are just signing on and sort of claiming tokens and then basically selling them and moving on. That's obviously a bunch of them as well, but actually people who sort of really kind of move on chain and do stuff. And again, that's because they have a wallet and now they're seeing the opportunity. They do stuff in DeFi, and again, I think we'll see that happening in the next 12 to 18 months. Obviously, the sort of the bets that we have is on reputation with Mochaverse, so that's something that we hope to really grow over the next 12 to 18 months, and I think that will become more and more important because airdrops are not going to reduce. Right. For us, airdrops is the sort of inverse of traditional marketing. Right. Instead of paying a company, you're paying essentially the user directly to sort of try out your product, for instance, right?
Hmm.
But that means you need to know, is this user a good user, a real user, right? And so I think reputation will ultimately solve that. And therefore, the better reputation you have, the more value you can give to the right person, the more value you receive back in return, right? So that I think is going to be a key component of creating sort of the right type of flywheel in Web3. And of course, the other big bet that we have is in education. That's much more long tail, so that's not necessarily the next 12 to 18 months, because education is sort of, in many ways, somewhat unsexy from a term, but is a $5 trillion space. And in fact, it's a thing that we do most of the time, even if we inadvertently don't know it. Like, for instance, the biggest learning platform in the world actually is YouTube, right?
Yeah.
But people don't necessarily appreciate that, and I think that's sort of a really big one, because I think of Web3 really as a framework for like kind of like what Elaji calls the network state, right? So we're
Yeah.
actually in a kind of metaverse of sorts already, right? Or the open metaverse, as we like to call it. And one of the key components on this is education, not just Web3 literacy or financial literacy, but just broadly, essentially, sort of bringing educators and education into the space, right? And
Hmm.
so that's a big driver for us as well, kind of what we're doing with Open Campus. But yeah, those are sort of some of our big initiatives. And of course, the other thing I would say, I mean, I spoke a lot about it in the years before, that I think Asia is going to be sort of the center, at least in the near term, just because they're much more friendlier and open towards Web3.
Yeah.
But I think the other prediction, I would say, that regardless of what happens and who wins the election, I do think, and maybe this is just optimist in me, that generally speaking, I think the US is going to try to reclaim its crown in Web3 over the next, let's call it, 1 to 2 years.
I'm hoping that's true. As a US based NFT project here, as the first to build out NFT memberships for our community of 7,000 plus, I have made that bet myself, Yat, and I'm hoping your lips to God's ears, my friend. But I think they just need examples of projects that are doing the things right. And I hope that Coinage can continue pioneering that. But yeah, I can't thank you enough for coming on, man. Thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it. And we hope to have you back again soon. And speaking for Coinage here, excited to be in the Mochaverse community as well as a holder. Keep grinding, my friend.
Thank, thank you so much, and thank you for hosting me, and congratulations on everything you guys are doing at Coinage. I definitely need to pay a lot more attention to what you guys are doing.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Yat Siu, the chairman at Animoca Brands. Thanks so much.